I was sitting with Christian on an old wooden bench as the evening sun cast long shadows across the garden. The sweet fragrance of roses mingled with the scent of other flowers that Christian's mother had tenderly nurtured over the years. It was a perfect spring day, the kind that makes everything feel more alive. The gentle breeze rustled through the trees, and I could sense something was different about Christian. After 3 years together, I knew him well enough to notice when he was lost in thought, unusually quiet. He was nervously fidgeting with a small box on his lap, occasionally glancing at me sideways as if gathering courage for something momentous. Finally, he told me he had something to give me, his voice carrying an unfamiliar weight. When he looked directly at me, those usually warm brown eyes held a strange gleam I couldn't quite understand. He tried to appear casual as he handed me the box, but I could feel the tension in his movement. The box was old, covered in blue velvet that had faded with the passage of time. Inside, I found a carefully folded dress, ivory in color with a slight yellowing that spoke of its age. As I cautiously touched it, feeling the fabric beneath my fingertips, Christian explained with what seemed like a rehearsed smile that it had belonged to his grandmother. He went on to tell me about their family tradition, how every bride had worn this dress, including his mother and grandmother, and now, his voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. My heart leaped, and not in a good way. I felt uncomfortable with his tone and the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes. It wasn't just that the dress wasn't my style. It was everything about the situation, the implicit pressure in his words, the weight of expectations hanging heavy in the air like storm clouds gathering. I tried to sound grateful when I said it was lovely, but the words came out hollow, and we both knew it. I could feel Christian stiffen beside me. He added, as if it settled everything, that his mother was looking forward to seeing me wear it. He said it was their way of officially welcoming a new bride into the family. I stared at the dress, feeling something rise in my throat. This was more than just a dress. It was a symbol of expectations and traditions that threatened my very identity. My mind wandered to the wedding dresses I'd been looking at in magazines, modern, elegant pieces that perfectly expressed who I was. How could I explain to Christian that wearing this antique dress felt like erasing a part of myself? As twilight deepened and the shadows lengthened, the air grew colder, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, trying to process everything that this moment meant. It wasn't just about the dress, but what it represented. His family's expectations, the traditions I was supposed to follow, their assumption that I would simply conform to their world without question. Throughout dinner, the dress weighed on me like a stone. Christian acted as if nothing significant had happened, chatting about wedding plans and the details his mother had suggested. Every mention of family traditions made me feel like I couldn't breathe. When we finally finished dinner and sat on the couch in his apartment, I summoned the courage I needed. My heart was pounding, but I knew I had to express my feelings before things got more complicated. I started by saying his name, working to keep my voice steady. I told him we needed to talk about the dress. He looked up from his phone, his expression shifting subtly. When he asked what about the dress, I told him directly that I wasn't comfortable wearing it. The words tumbled out faster than I'd intended, as if they'd been waiting for this moment. I started to explain that I understood how important it was to his family, but he cut me off with a tone I'd never heard before. His voice was cold and distant, like he was speaking to a stranger rather than his fiancé. He dismissed my concerns, saying it was just a dress and he couldn't understand why I was making such a big deal out of it. His words hit me like a slap across the face. Making a big deal? Was that how he saw my attempt to express my honest feelings? I felt years of buried frustration rising inside me like a tide. I tried to keep my composure as I explained that this wasn't just about a dress, Christian, though I could hear my voice trembling. This was about what it represented. Having a voice in my own wedding, being able to make personal choices about what to wear on one of the most important days of my life. He stood up from the sofa, running his fingers through his hair in frustration. He reminded me that every woman in his family had worn this dress, and his mother was so looking forward to seeing me in it. Then he asked if I couldn't do this one thing for us. For us. I repeated, my voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. Or was it for his mother, I asked, since everything about the wedding seemed to need her approval. The silence that followed was heavy and tense. Christian was looking at me like he didn't know who I was, and maybe he didn't. Maybe this was the first time he was seeing this side of me. The part that refused to just smile and keep the peace. Finally, he spoke with a voice filled with disappointment and anger, saying he thought I would understand how important this was to his family. He thought I wanted to be part of their family. I felt tears welling up as I told him that I did want to be part of his family. But not at the cost of losing myself, not by starting our marriage by giving up something so important to me just because of tradition. The conversation continued late into the night, but we couldn't reach an agreement. Every word we exchanged appeared to broaden the between us, exposing differences we had overlooked. When I finally went to bed, I felt a weight in my chest unlike anything I'd experienced before. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning, replaying our conversation over and over in my mind. Was I overreacting as Christian suggested? Was it selfish to resist family tradition? Yet every time I thought about wearing that dress, I felt a part of myself withering away. When morning came, after a sleepless night, I had both courage and clear resolve. I needed to talk to Christian's mother directly. I couldn't let this situation snowball any further. I found her in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as usual. The fresh coffee aroma filled the room, and for a moment, I hesitated to disturb this facade of peace. But I knew this conversation was necessary. I asked if we could talk, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. She looked up from the cup she was pouring, regarding me with curiosity. She gestured to a chair, saying, of course, what was on my mind. Her usual gentle tone made what I had to say even more difficult. I sat down, nervously fidgeting with my hands under the table. I brought up the wedding dress, and I noticed her expression subtly shift. Her face brightened as she mentioned her mother's dress, saying it was lovely and she'd been thinking of taking it to the seamstress to be fitted for my size. I took a deep breath and told her that was the problem. I explained that wearing it at the wedding made me uncomfortable. The ensuing silence was so that it felt almost tangible. I watched her smile slowly fade, transforming into an expression I'd never seen before. She asked what I meant by uncomfortable, trying to maintain a neutral tone but unable to hide her displeasure. I carefully chose my words, acknowledging that it was a beautiful dress and important to the family. But I explained that it wasn't me, wasn't my style, and I wanted to wear something that expressed who I was on my wedding day. I saw her straighten in her chair, like a soldier preparing for battle. Her voice grew colder with each word as she explained how this dress had been passed down through generations in their family. She said every bride had worn it, that it was a tradition that bound their family together. I tried to say I understood, but she cut me off, no longer hiding her anger. She lashed out, saying she thought I was different when I chose Christian. She thought I understood what it meant to become part of their family. But apparently, I only thought about myself. Her words hit me like a slap. Was I being selfish? Was it wrong to want a say in my own wedding dress? I felt anger swelling inside me as I responded that this wasn't fair. I wasn't rejecting the family, I just wanted the right to choose my own wedding dress. Her laugh was short and bitter. She said what was truly unfair was me coming here and trying to change traditions that had lasted for generations, showing contempt for something so precious to them. The conversation was rapidly spinning out of control. Each word exchanged created new wounds, revealing deeper disagreements. The coffee in our cups grew cold, forgotten in the rising tension. I tried to explain that I wasn't showing contempt, but I could see in her eyes she wasn't really listening anymore. I told her I just wanted to find middle ground, a way to respect tradition without losing myself in the process. She repeated the word middle ground with contempt. She said tradition wasn't something to negotiate. You either accepted it or you didn't. She wondered what other traditions I'd want to change if I couldn't accept something as simple as wearing the family wedding dress. We heard footsteps on the stairs at that moment, and Christian appeared in the kitchen doorway. His expression darkened as he seemed to understand what was happening at first glance. He asked what was going on, though he must have known. His mother spat out that his fiancé had just announced she wouldn't wear his grandmother's dress. When Christian looked at me, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. It was a mixture of disappointment and anger that chilled me to the bone. He asked why I couldn't just leave things alone, his voice barely recognizable. Leave things alone? I repeated, feeling tears welling up. How can I just leave something alone that directly affects one of the most important days of my life? I asked. It's just a dress, he shouted, slamming his fist on the table, making us all jump. He accused me of having to make it an issue, having to defy his mother, being unable to simply respect tradition. I stood up from my chair, trembling not from fear but from a mixture of anger and sadness that threatened to suffocate me. Fighting to keep my voice steady, I told him that if he couldn't understand why this was important to me, maybe we needed to rethink more than just the dress. The silence that followed was deafening. Christian's mother looked back and forth between us like she was watching an intense tennis match. The man in front of me, my fiancé, who I thought would always be on my side, looked at me like I was a stranger. Finally, in a voice so cold I barely recognized it, he told me I should leave. He said, I needed time to think about what I really wanted. I felt an odd calm settle over me as I responded that I knew exactly what I wanted. I wanted respect, to have my decisions valued, and a fiancé who could understand that. I walked out of the kitchen with my head held high, though inside I was crumbling. As I climbed the stairs to our room, I could hear angry whispers continuing below. Words like ungrateful, selfish, and a spoiled reached my ears like tiny daggers. The tension in the house was unbearable. As I packed a small bag with essentials, I could feel the air heavy with unspoken emotions and unsaid words. How had it come to this? How had one dress caused all of this? The day before the wedding, I felt like I was living in a stranger's house. The hallways that once felt welcoming now felt cold and hostile. Christian and I barely made eye contact, and when we did, I saw resentment growing in his eyes with each passing hour. I spent most of the day in my room, sitting by the window watching the sun move across the sky. I could hear Christian's family discussing wedding preparations for a ceremony I wasn't even sure I wanted anymore. The dress hung like a ghost in the closet, a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. As evening approached, I decided to go down to the kitchen to find something to eat. I hadn't eaten all day, and though I wasn't hungry, I knew I needed to stay strong. The house was unusually quiet. The family had gone out for final wedding preparations. While I was making a sandwich, I heard Christian's footsteps entering the kitchen. His presence filled the space with an almost tangible tension. I turned around slowly, still holding the butter knife. Without preamble, he asked if I was going to continue with this attitude. His voice held emotions I couldn't quite identify. He asked if I was determined to ruin everything with my stubbornness. I set the knife down on the counter, trying to maintain my composure. I told him I wasn't the one ruining everything. I told him I'd only asked to choose my own wedding dress. He exploded, taking several steps toward me, saying I always had to have my way. He demanded to know why I couldn't just do this one thing for him and his family, why I always had to be different. For you? I felt anger swelling inside me as I responded. I asked when he would ever do something for me, when he would take my side. Take your side? His laugh was bitter, almost cruel. I saw his hand rise and felt the impact on my cheek. The blow made me stumble, hitting the counter behind me. The physical pain was intense, but the emotional shock was even worse. We stood frozen for a moment, both stunned by what had just happened. I watched Christian's expression change from anger to horror, as if waking from a dream. He raised his hand again, this time in apology, but I was already backing away. Stay away from me, I whispered, holding my burning cheek as uncontrollable tears began to fall. He started to say, but his voice trailed off. Then he blamed me, saying I had provoked him, that if I had just. You're blaming me? Disbelief gave me the strength to speak. I asked if he was really trying to justify hitting me. Get out, he said, and shouting obscenities. The sounds of his rage made me move faster. I walked out the front door without looking back, not caring that it was getting dark or that I had nowhere specific to go. The night was cold, or maybe it was fear making me shiver. I walked quickly through the familiar streets that now seemed strange and threatening. The warm lights from neighboring houses shone indifferently, disconnected from the chaos I'd just experienced. Somewhere a dog barked, making me jump. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. How had it come to this? How had the man who promised to love and protect me become someone who could hurt me? The signs had been there. His need for control, his inability to take my side, his constant deference to his family. But I had refused to see them, telling myself love could overcome everything. As I walked without direction, one thought began to take shape in my mind. I couldn't let this stand. I couldn't let Christian think he could treat me this way and get away with it. My cheek still stung, but my pride hurt even more. My trust had been shattered by the betrayal of someone who was supposed to protect me. I took out my phone and called my best friend, Lexi. After 3 rings, she answered with a cheerful voice. She was probably expecting details about wedding preparations. That cheerfulness turned to concern the moment she heard my tear-choked voice. Lexi lived in a small apartment about 20 minutes away. When she opened the door and saw my face, her expression changed from worry to horror. Without saying a word, she hugged me and led me to her sofa. That's where I completely broke down and told her everything. About the dress, the arguments, the violence. Her eyes grew darker with each detail I shared. When I finished, she got up and went to the kitchen. She came back with an ice pack wrapped in a kitchen towel. Put this on your cheek, she said gently. It'll help with the swelling. I stared at the ice pack in my hands, watching tiny drops of condensation fall onto my fingers. Each drop felt like a memory of tears I'd shed for someone who wasn't worth it. We should go to the police, Lexi suggested as she sat beside me. I shook my head. I told her I didn't want to make it public, and besides, his family had connections, so it probably wouldn't matter. Then what do you want to do? She asked, wrapping both her hands around my free one. I fell silent for a moment. I could feel my initial sadness transforming into something darker, more resolute. Finally, I said I wanted him to feel what I had felt. I wanted him to know what it was like to feel powerless, scared, and betrayed. Are you talking about revenge? Lexi asked, her eyes showing a mixture of understanding and concern. I'm talking about justice, I answered, surprised by the strength in my voice. I couldn't let him think he could treat people this way and just move on, I explained. What if he did this to someone else in the future? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the sofa bed Lexi had prepared, staring at the ceiling and turning thoughts over in my mind. I didn't want to do anything illegal or violent. I refused to become like him. But I needed to make him understand, to feel even a fraction of the fear and helplessness I had experienced. I took out my phone and started taking notes, writing down everything I knew about Christian. His fears, his insecurities, the secrets he'd shared during our years together. Every small detail may prove useful and could become a crucial part of my accountability puzzle. The next morning, while Lexi was getting ready for work, an initial plan was taking shape in my mind. Not something impulsive or immediate, but something carefully calculated that would force him to face his own demons. "Are you sure about this?" Lexi asked as she put on her shoes. She suggested I could just leave and start fresh somewhere else. "If I just walk away, he wins," I replied, sipping the coffee she'd made me. I told her that people shouldn't be allowed to treat others this way and get away with it. After Lexi left, I opened my laptop and began my research. First, I made a list of all our mutual acquaintances. People who had known Christian for years might have valuable information. Employees at his family's business might have grievances of their own. As I dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Christian's controlling nature hadn't been directed solely at me. He'd left a trail of broken relationships, both personal and professional. People who had been manipulated, controlled, and intimidated by him and his family. I started reaching out to these people, presenting myself as another person he had hurt. The responses began trickling in. Each message confirmed what I already knew. Christian had a dark side that had been hidden for a long time. An ex-girlfriend told me how he'd isolated her from her friends. A former business partner shared how Christian's family had pressured him until his business collapsed. Each story became another piece of the puzzle, proving that what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. "I don't want to hurt him physically," I explained to Lexi when she returned from work. "I wanted him to face the consequences of his actions, to let all the people he'd hurt find their voices." My friend studied me for a long moment before nodding. She asked what I needed. "Connections," I answered. I needed people who could help spread information legally but effectively, and I needed to find more of his victims. I spent the next few days building a network. Each person Christian had hurt had their own story, their own pain to share. I wasn't alone, and that realization gave me the strength to move forward. At 3 a.m., 2 days after I'd left the house, my phone rang. Christian's name flashed on the screen. I stared at it for a moment, feeling my heart pound harder. Lexi appeared from the next room where she'd been sleeping, having heard the ringtone. "It's him," I whispered, showing her the screen. She advised me not to answer, but something inside me knew I should. I answered with trembling hands. "Please," his voice was barely audible. "It's important." I sat on the bed, feeling my body instinctively tense. "What do you want?" "I can't talk about it on the phone," his voice dropped to a whisper. "Strange things are happening, strange things. I need help." Part of me wanted to hang up, block him, and forget he existed. But another part, the part that had been waiting for this moment, remained steady. "What things?" Someone is sending emails to all my contacts. Weird messages, photos, private conversations. The phone won't stop ringing. Everyone's questioning me, accusing me. I bit my lip to hide my smile. The puzzle pieces were falling into place faster than I'd expected. "Why are you asking me for help?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice was broken. He said it was because I knew him best, and because what happened before was wrong. He was. The violence. I finished his sentence, remembering the pain in my cheek. "Or everything else you've done." "Please," his voice trembled. He asked if we could meet, suggesting somewhere public. The cafe at the shopping mall at 10 a.m. tomorrow. I looked at Lexi, who had heard everything. She nodded slowly. Okay, I finally answered. I started to warn him if he tried anything. I won't, he cut me off quickly. I promise. I just want to talk. After I hung up, Lexi sat next to me on the bed. She asked if I was really sure about this. This is exactly what I expected, I replied, feeling a strange calmness settle over me. All the people he'd hurt, all the secrets he'd kept were coming to light, and he was scared. The next morning, I arrived at the cafe 30 minutes early. I chose a table where I could see both the entrance and the emergency exit. Lexi sat at another table, pretending to read a book. We couldn't take any chances. When Christian walked in, I barely recognized him. The elegant, confident man I'd known was gone. In his place was a disheveled man in wrinkled clothes with unkempt hair who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes darted nervously around the cafe as if expecting someone to jump out at him. He spotted me and approached with unsteady steps. He stopped in front of my table, seeming unsure if he was allowed to sit. Please, I gestured to the chair across from me. He sat down and began fidgeting nervously with a napkin. Thank you for coming, he mumbled. I observed him silently. The dark circles under his eyes, his foot tapping anxiously under the table. This was a man backed into a corner. What's happening, Christian? I asked, though I already knew everything. Everything's falling apart, he answered in a whisper. He told me people from his past, former employees, even family were receiving information about things he'd done and said, all of it factual. With a little pressure, he looked at me and in an instant. It's all true, he finally admitted. He asked who could be doing this, who could have this much information. The question hung between us. I took a sip of coffee, enjoying this moment more than I probably should. Perhaps, I finally said, it's all the people you've hurt over the years. Everyone you've controlled, manipulated, and threatened. Maybe they've finally decided they've had enough. I saw the moment of realization in his widening eyes. The moment he understood, I knew more than I was letting on. You? He started but couldn't seem to find the courage to finish the question. Violence isn't always just physical, Christian, I said quietly. I explained that sometimes it's manipulation and control, making others feel small to make yourself feel big. And sometimes, those small people come together and become stronger than you could imagine. Christian stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. The coffee between us grew cold, forgotten in the tense moment. His previously fidgeting hands were now still on the table. How? He finally asked, his voice barely audible. He wanted to know how I'd gotten the information. It wasn't hard, I replied calmly. I told him I wasn't the only one he'd hurt, and when I started looking for stories, they appeared like raindrops becoming a storm. I leaned forward and lowered my voice. I asked if he remembered Trisha, the woman who'd worked at his family's company and suddenly quit. I told him she had an interesting story about his harassment and threats. I asked about Matthew, his former business partner, if he'd ever told anyone how he'd been pressured into selling his shares for almost nothing. With each name I mentioned, I could see the color drain from his face. It was like watching a mask fall away, revealing the true person underneath. That's lies, he tried to defend himself, but there was no conviction in his voice. Really? I asked calmly. Was it a lie when you hit me? Or all the times you manipulated situations to get your way? He ran his fingers through his hair. That familiar gesture of a cornered man. He mumbled that he didn't know, that there were expectations. The family, the business, everything depended on maintaining a certain image. And that image justifies hurting others? I pressed. I asked if it justified becoming someone who controls others through violence and fear. I saw tears forming in his eyes. It was shocking to see this once strong, dominating man cry, but I felt no satisfaction. I only felt a deep sadness, thinking of what might have been if things had been different. Everything's falling apart, he whispered, as if talking to himself. His family, business, reputation. Everything he'd built. Built on lies and other people's pain, I cut in. That's what's crumbling now. A heavy silence followed, filled with truths we'd both been avoiding. Lexi kept pretending to read at her table, watching our every move. Other customers passed by our table, oblivious to the drama unfolding. "What do you want?" Christian finally asked in a defeated voice. He asked if I wanted money or revenge. "I want you to understand," I answered, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. I wanted him to know what it felt like to be on the other side, to live with fear when someone has power over you and you don't know what's coming next. He visibly shrank at my words. He mumbled that he was sorry, for the violence, for everything. "That's not enough," I cut him off. I told him I didn't want his apologies. I wanted him to change. I wanted him to face everyone he'd hurt, apologize to them, take responsibility for his actions. And then, he looked up and asked, "What if he talked to everyone and tried to make things right?" "Then things might start getting better," I replied. "The leaks might stop, and people might start to see he was truly trying to change." I watched understanding dawn on his face. This wasn't just a threat. It was an opportunity for redemption, however difficult and painful. "It won't be easy," he continued. "Some people wouldn't want to listen, wouldn't believe he could change. You'll have to prove your sincerity through actions." Christian nodded slowly, as if each movement required great effort. "Where do I start?" "Start at the beginning," I answered. "Start by being honest with yourself and others about who you were and who you want to become. Stop hiding behind excuses and family traditions, and start being truthful, even when it hurts." I stood up from the table, feeling I'd said everything that needed to be said. "The choice is yours, Christian. You can let everything continue to fall apart, or use this as a real chance to change." As I walked toward the exit with Lexi following discreetly, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. This wasn't the ending I'd imagined when I started planning my revenge, but somehow it felt more right, more meaningful. The following days were strange. Messages kept coming in from acquaintances, telling me Christian had contacted them. At first, many thought it was some kind of trick, a strategy to improve his image. But there was something different about how he approached people. Trisha, the former employee, was the first to call me. Her voice trembled as she described their meeting. She told me he sat across from her and cried, apologizing for harassing her and using his power to threaten her. He'd even offered to formally acknowledge what he'd done in front of HR and write an official letter of admission. Matthew messaged a week later. Christian hadn't just apologized. He'd proposed a plan to compensate for the losses from the forced stock sale. The most surprising call came from his mother. Through tears, she told me how Christian had called a family meeting and confessed everything. He'd admitted using family traditions as an excuse for control and manipulation, how his fear of disappointing them had turned him into someone he didn't even recognize. I sat on Lexi's small balcony, processing this information. The sunset painted the sky pink and orange, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe deeply. Lexi sat beside me with tea. She asked how I felt about all of this. "It's strange," I admitted. "When I planned this, I wanted him to suffer, to feel fear and shame. But now?" "But now?" she asked gently. "Now I feel like something good might come from this, not just for me, but for everyone he hurt. As weeks passed, Christian's transformation became more evident. He wasn't just facing his past, he was taking concrete steps to change the future. He implemented anti-harassment policies at the family business, established a fund to support employees who report abuse, and started regular therapy. One day, I ran into him while buying coffee at the mall. The contrast with our last meeting was striking. Instead of a defeated, frightened man, he seemed like someone who'd found reconciliation with himself. He asked if we could talk, maintaining a respectful distance. We sat at a nearby table, this time without tension, just a strange sense of ending. After a silence, he said he wanted to thank me. He admitted that what I'd done, exposing everything, had been painful but necessary. "I didn't do it for you," I answered honestly. "I know," he nodded. He said he understood I'd done it for justice, for everyone he'd hurt, but it had helped him see who he really was and who he wanted to become. He told me about his therapy, learning to control his anger and need for control, about difficult conversations with his family. Some supported him, while others saw him as a traitor to tradition. "The grandmother's dress," he said with a slight smile, "I donated it to the local history museum." Mother eventually understood that tradition should be a connection we choose to maintain, not chains that bind us. As I listened to him, I felt something healing inside me. The fear and anger I'd carried for so long were melting away, replaced by a quiet peace. He told me he wasn't asking for forgiveness. What he'd done, the violence, the control, was unforgivable, but he wanted me to know he was working to become a better person, to never hurt anyone that way again. "Forgiveness is a process," I finally responded. I couldn't promise it now, but I was glad to see him changing. We said goodbye with simple gestures, knowing our paths would rarely cross again. Watching him leave, I realized that sometimes revenge transforms into something bigger than ourselves, a chance for real change. Months later, I was packing up my things in Lexi's apartment. Carefully labeled boxes filled the small living room while my friend watched from the sofa with a bittersweet expression. She asked if I was really okay, though she knew the answer. "Yes," I replied, sealing the final box. "A new city is waiting. I've got the job, the apartment's ready." Deciding to move to another city wasn't easy, but I knew it was necessary. This wasn't running away. It was a fresh start. The job offer as a project coordinator at a tech company came at perfect timing, as if the universe was showing me the way. Lexi hugged me from behind. I looked out the window at the neighborhood that had sheltered me through these difficult months, now looking different, as if it had served its purpose in my life. "You know what's strangest?" I turned to her and said. "I felt like my future had been stolen, but now you have a completely new future stretching out in front of you," she finished with a smile. That night, sitting on the floor among boxes eating pizza, we reflected on everything that had happened. We talked about how my plan for revenge had evolved into something bigger than ourselves, helping not just me but many others find their voices. "Remember when Trisha called to tell you she was starting a support group?" Lexi said, reaching for another slice. I smiled at the memory. Christian's former employee had turned her experience into something positive. She now ran a support group for workplace harassment survivors, and her story was inspiring others to speak up. Moving day dawned bright and clear. While the moving truck waited downstairs, Lexi helped me carry down the last box. As I closed the apartment door for the final time, I felt a strange mix of emotions. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from Christian's mother. Since our first confrontation, our relationship had developed in ways neither of us had expected. We weren't friends, but there was a quiet mutual respect, an understanding. Her message read, "Wishing you luck on your new path. Thank you for showing us the truth, even though it hurt. I put my phone away without replying. Sometimes silence is the best way to close a chapter. As Lexi drove me to the station, I reflected on what I'd learned. I discovered strength within myself I never knew existed, that justice can take unexpected forms, and sometimes the best revenge is creating positive change. Isn't it interesting? I said to Lexi during a red light. In the end, this was never really about the dress. She glanced at me and smiled. No, it wasn't. It was about finding your voice and never letting anyone take your power away. At the airport, we held each other for a long time. Lexi had been more than a friend. She'd been my support, my confidant, my strength when I needed it most. Promise me you'll be careful, she said, tears in her eyes. I promise, I replied, feeling my own eyes well up. I promise I'll visit soon. As I sat on the seat, I watched the city I was leaving behind through the window. I wasn't running away. I was leaving to grow. Each mile the plane traversed brought me to my new future. A future I had chosen, built from the ashes of what could have been tragedy. I took out my notebook and began to write. I wasn't sure if it was a letter, a diary entry, or just random thoughts, but the words flowed naturally. It was a story of falling and redemption, of pain and healing, of revenge and forgiveness. My story, one I hoped might help others find their own strength. The scenery outside the window changed rapidly, and I could feel my life changing with it. A future full of possibilities stretched out before me, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of what was coming. I was ready to write my next chapter. This time, completely in my own words.